It's my pleasure to launch us into part 2 of Professor Carol Dougherty's fascinating deep dive into the Odyssey and the Homeric world. By way of introduction, I'm going to do say very little because she has been already, I think, very thoroughly introduced to you all in our previous session. But I will say that I felt personally a lot of resonance between this morning's presentation and a little bit of this last 200 years of living in the story of Vermont in certainly post-settlement. In particular, the experience of the tremendous outmigration of Vermont in the mid-19th century, early 19th century, where so much of its population moved to the Ohio Valley and points west. And what it did, not only the impact of that, not only on those who left, but particularly on those who were left behind. Also, the experience of Vermont during the Civil War, which being a very rural and isolated state, sent so many young men to places that could have been as far in their terms of their experiences, the Greek islands, when they ended up in places like Louisiana. And the strangeness of that and the difficulty upon the return. And even today, I think about young people in this state who often leave after they graduate high school, and in some cases they return later in life, but this is always an issue of leaving and return with the youth of Vermont. And lastly, I think of the words of a great Vermonter, George Perkins Marsh, who once wrote something to the effect, I don't have the exact words in front of me, but every middle-aged man who returns to the landscape of their birth returns to a different landscape than of their youthful toils and pleasures. So as we move forward now, we will have an opportunity to have a conversation about the challenging and the many challenges of returning to an unrecognizable place and the relationship between the familiar and the foreign. Please welcome, once again, Professor Dougherty.
Okay, so there's a handout that is going around. Hopefully everybody's gotten, they may have more piles, may have ended up on one table or not. And so I'll let that settle. And what I'd also love to do, I was under the impression that this breakout session would be a little bit more discussion-oriented, and we're still a fairly large group. So what I'm going to propose is that we talk a little bit together, kind of walk through some of my questions, and then you discuss amongst yourselves at your own table for a while. I'll float around and visit, and then we'll come back together. So I'm counting on, I assume many of you out here are teachers, past, present, or future, so you can help me with this exercise. So what I really want to do right now is to really sort of flesh out the question that I ended with, which is what the question of the foreigner is. So I briefly mentioned the work of Bonnie Honig, who is a political theorist who works particularly on theories of democracy. And what I found really kind of game-changing in terms of the way that she poses that we frame the question of the foreigner not so much as what we need to do about them, but why do we keep bringing foreigners into the discussion? So why is it that so many stories of how we were founded are of a founder or someone who comes from afar? Greek democracy is full of stories of foreign founders, of legends of foreign lawgivers. Oedipus himself had to come from somewhere else in order to solve the riddle of the Sphinx. Rousseau's foreign lawgiver. It's an interesting question to think about. And one of the things that she focuses on is a phrase, the undecidability of the foreigner, which I think is a really useful phrase. Not the same as the ambiguity. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they us? Are we them? But it's undecidable. And I think that's really productive, is to think about how we're constantly trying to decide, or it provides us with a framework for continuing to decide what the question of the foreigner is. I've put as the opening quotation on your handout a phrase, a brief little discussion of the question of the foreigner from Jacques Derrida, from a series of an essay on the question of hospitality. And so let me just read that, because he's also coming to the question of the foreigner as a useful heuristic, as a useful framework for us to think about ourselves. He says, the question of the foreigner is the question of the foreigner addressed to the foreigner, as though the foreigner were first of all the one who puts the question, or the one to whom you address the first question, as though the foreigner were being in question, the very question of being in question, the question being, or being in question of the question, but also the one who, putting the first question, puts me in question. So that's a lot of questions, right? And very French. And so that's one of the things that we can start off, is what the heck does he mean here? But one of the, I think, sort of the place to start is also sort of has to do with those of you who remember from your ancient Greek. Is the question, is it a subjective genitive, the question of the foreigner? It is the question that the foreigner asks when he or she arrives. Or is it an objective genitive? Is it questions we have about the foreigner, right? So there's a place to start, right? The question of the foreigner. Who's doing this? Who's doing the speaking? And then also, I think part of what Derrida is again opening up is this possibility that questions about what is foreign, what is home, are really quite important questions about how to ask questions, right? It is the process where we start, and it's the process of being in question, of putting something into question, of putting ourselves into question. And so it can be about much more than what it starts out about being. All right, so that's a lot to chew over. I have put on the handout, I put 3 questions that the Odyssey poses itself as starting positions. So the first is pretty much follows up from the lecture that I just gave, the set of questions that Odysseus asks when he lands on different shores and when he arrives at home. So what is this question? So one place to start maybe is to sort of flesh out that argument. What are we thinking about in terms of the appropriate way to respond to a stranger in need? What obligations do we have as civilized people? Is Xenia a good model for negotiating relationships that straddle time and place? And interesting, one of the rules about Xenia is that you don't ask questions, that you give hospitality first and ask questions later. So there's I think an opening place. And then second, I gave you a passage with which to mull over the question of Odysseus, of violence. And we touched upon this already in the question and answer period. But I've given you the quotation from one of the suitors who's trying to stop Odysseus. And he says, so spare your own people. Later we'll recoup your cost with a tax laid down upon the land, covering all we ate and drank inside your halls. And each of us will pay full measure too. 20 oxen in value. Bronze and gold we'll give until we melt your heart. Before we've settled, who on earth could blame you for your rage? So I think this is an interesting question, again, that the Odyssey is asking. Not just, will you stop, and also that the Odyssey allows us to ask about immigrants, about an immigrant experience, not only are you violent? Odysseus is violent. He's described as a bloody lion more than once when he arrives on foreign shores. That is clearly part of the question that we ask about the foreigner. Are you here to do us harm? What do we think about that? But also what I like is how this question ends with, who could blame you for your rage, right? That's a question that we need to ask as well. So that's another kind of node or another place that the poem is, I think, asking questions that we might want to think about. And then the last is, what's your name? So this is a question that Odysseus is asked over and over again, and here is the point where Alcinous, after he has lavished untold hospitality upon Odysseus for 3 books, food, drink, all kinds of things, he says at the end, "Come tell us the name they call you there at home, your mother, father, townsmen, neighbors round about. Surely no man in the world is nameless, all told. Born high, born low, as soon as he sees the light, his parents always name him once he's born. And tell me your land, your people, your city too, so our ships can sail you home, their wits will speed them there." So this is the question, what's your name? Who are you? Which is a more specific question from the one that Odysseus, what is this land, what I've come to, what is the generic, who are these people here? But now we've gotten personal. Who are you? Who are you? Where did you come from? Who's your family? What do they call you? And because, as Alcinous says, no one is nameless. Well, of course, the person who is absolutely nameless in the Odyssey is Odysseus. And not only because the name that he takes the way he tricks the Cyclops is by saying, "My name is nobody," right? So after he blinds the Cyclops and the Cyclops' little friends are saying, "Who's hurting you? Is somebody harming you by trickery or by force?" And Polyphemus yells out, "Nobody is tricking me by trickery and not by force." And the other little Cyclopses say, "Okay, well, nobody's hurting you, I'll go." And so that's part of that, and we've talked about how that is so, that experience of being nobody that Odysseus manages to use to survive, right? It's that anonymity that he then adopts again in the second half of the poem when he comes home without a name, and that's what allows him to come home. There's another level to that pun in Greek, so that the Greek has 2 ways of saying nobody. And one is the overt sort of pun where he says, "My name is Utis. Utis is my name. It's nobody." But the other is a pun on a hypothetical way of saying nobody in Greek. And there the pun is on metis. And metis is the Greek word for cunning or cleverness. So the way the Cyclopes pose the question is, surely no one is harming you, uses the metis form of nobody. So there's a double level to that pun in the Greek that says not only is Odysseus Mr. Nobody, but he's also the man of metis, of intelligence, of cleverness, of strategy. And in fact, I think part of what it's saying is that there is a strategy to being anonymous, right? That those 2 things are connected. So I think this opens up, again, really interesting questions about what we think about foreigners, immigrants coming to our lands. Do we demand their name? What is their name? What does it mean to refuse them their name, to treat them as if they were just an anonymous group? Are there productive potentials to being anonymous, to being able to reinvent your identity? Part of what the poem is so interested in is this question of identity, right? And it's not just, is it Odysseus that has come home, but also the sense of identity as being the identical sameness, as being the same person, right? And we've talked a little bit about how no one is still the same anymore. Home's not the same, you're not the same. So really this kind of question of what identity is and what role your name plays and what that question about identifying and naming has to do through this whole process. So I offer those as 3 places to start. 3 questions that I think the poem is enabling us to think further about. You might have other questions, or you might have other things that you want to say. So I was hoping that you all could discuss amongst yourselves. I think those of you who are sitting alone at a table, you're going to have to either discuss with yourselves or hopefully join another table. And I'll float around and come back and then in about 20, and then each table perhaps come up with one contribution, one point, one question that you want to contribute to the group, and then we can all come back together in about 15 or 20 minutes. Okay? Does that sound good? All right? Go. A 1-minute warning. Okay. Can we come back? I really hate to interrupt all these great conversations. And I have to say, whenever I do this in my college, when I go around from group to group, everyone's usually talking about something else. So you guys are excellent students. All right. So where do we go from here? Does anybody, we could work through the different questions, or I kind of would rather go with a group that feels that they want to share, that have a place to start. Is there anybody that wants to go first? Yes.
I'll bring the mic to you here so everyone can hear.
We spent a fair amount of time talking about the whole concept of xenia. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Xenia.
Xenia, thank you. The concept of hospitality. And wondered, even at the time of Odysseus, did that concept of hospitality extend beyond the aristocracy? If it was one of Odysseus' sailors rather than Odysseus himself, would he have been treated as cordially as he was? And we assume there are always markers of status in whatever society you're part of, and that led us to then think about today and the concept of hospitality, particularly as related to immigration, and whether or not it's still the case that the named can get in, but the nobodies can't. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, and I don't want to be the one that answers all these response, but I do want to say something about, if others groups or individuals want to chime in, but I do want to say something about Xenia. It originally was an institution that was an aristocratic one, so clearly that's what we were talking about a little bit before, that clearly that's who was traveling originally, was the people who had the connections and the wherewithal to do it. The archaic period then becomes a moment where more people can travel, because now you can travel to make money through trade. So there is a little bit of a sort of a point of conflict over that. And so Odysseus's men would only have been traveling in the company of Odysseus. They wouldn't have had the wherewithal to be traveling on their own. But to think about Xenia as an institution that we might embrace. I have to tell you, I heard part of a TED Talk by the guy who founded Airbnb. And when he was talking about how he came up with the idea for Airbnb, he was, he kind of was at some conference and he crashed on someone's floor, and he thought, maybe I could, develop this as a model. And so one of the things that the challenges he was faced with was, how do you get strangers? How do you get people to let strangers into your home, right? And one of the things, so that's part of why he said, I have to go to great lengths to make that people willing to do that. And so that's why when you set up an Airbnb account, you have to have a picture. And there's a guideline for the amount of information, just a little bit to make you seem like a real person, not too much, so you're sharing too much, right? But as I'm listening to this, I thought, this is Xenia. This is, again, an attempt to try to figure out a way in which we can feel good about letting strangers into our homes. And so I think that's kind of an interesting possible. And I know that Airbnb has been really, Airbnb hosts have been really great in California recently with opening up Airbnbs to fire refugees from the fires. And so, but I think it's maybe not impossible for us to try to embrace that challenge. If we think about it in terms, that's what I thought was interesting about the Airbnb guy, is he knew just what the problem was. It was, I'm not letting some stranger into my house, right? So, can we think about what worked for him? Can we sort of upscale that a little bit? Did others want to tackle xenia or hospitality or? Yeah, okay.
We talked about some similar things, and most of all, the overarching theme being how this sense of hospitality or inviting in a foreigner puts the host in question and who they are in question. And we talked about how in the Odyssey and those ways of hospitality, the expectation was that the host proved themselves to be trustworthy before they asked if the stranger was trustworthy. Whereas it's shifted a little bit, and now we ask the stranger to prove themselves trustworthy before the host accepts them. And the question that we ended with was, where does that distrust come from? Because if we think of the dominant cultural ethos of America, that's what we expect. But if we ask where those narratives come from, we are kind of hard-pressed to find examples of opening your doors and then, oops, someone is a murderer or a stranger, and that those examples are less frequent than the examples of actual hospitality. And so if that's true, where does this narrative of the stranger having to prove themselves trustworthy come from?
Yeah, where do you think? Any ideas? How has that story shifted? Yeah. Both people are strange to each other.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So I think part of it's who's telling the story and who's doing the moving, right? So that's, again, I think that's what's interesting is, I like the way you put it, when Odysseus is traveling around, the burden is on the host to say, he's like, well, I don't know, who are you? Are you going to be nice to me or are you not going to be nice to me? And it's from that, the questions are then from his point of view, rather than we only get at the end, we get a little bit of Alcinous or his friends saying, who are you? You don't look like an athlete to me. But it is, again, that same question being posed from different points of view. So part of it maybe getting ourselves to think about the question, again, coming from the foreigner rather than not just being about the foreigner.
I had told, while you were at our table, I had told a story, and then in discussing, I came up with another story that illustrated what I was trying to say with that story. I should indicate here that I come at things because I've taught creative writing and stuff, experiential. So I thought of myself that we are all strangers in any context, but I found when I had two experiences, but the one I'm going to talk about is the one I had in Tennessee. I had just finished teaching in Vermont, and I got a teaching job at a unit of the University of Tennessee in Martin, in western Tennessee. And of course, everyone there talked strange. They were strangers to me, and their politics were even stranger, because this was back in the late 60s when Nixon was running for president and Wallace was also very popular. And about my first day on campus, I was walking toward, I think, my classroom, and this student came walking along. He stopped, looked at me, pointed at me, and said, "You are the one." And I said, and I recoiled because I was not a Nixon supporter. And I said, oh, no, I'm not the one. He says, no, I'm not talking about politics. I have just written a one-act play for my drama class, and you are going to be one of the characters in this play. And so I ceased being a stranger to this person, and then we got to talking about it at our table of how he was a stranger to me, I was a stranger to him, but we happened to hit on common ground. And sometimes this happens fortuitously. I think it's harder to happen nowadays because we live in silos, as they say. We just go to the sources that are going to feed back what we have heard or that our tribe believes in. And then it got me to thinking that basically if we open up, we cease being strangers to each other, at least not quite in the same way. So what the question we came up with, if I can read my handwriting, how does the foreigner help to frame who I am? How does the foreigner help frame who I am?
Okay, I think, you raise an interesting idea. I think we've attended in focusing on a current refugee crisis, or focusing on immigration crisis, and we're focusing on some people who are moving too much. And yet, equally important is the fact that some people are not moving at all, right? And that there are those of us who don't get out, who don't encounter new people, that don't have those kinds of encounters with someone that's new, that will not only tell you about somebody else, but also will inform who you are. And so I think that it's kind of a crisis of mobility and immobility on both from both points of view. So that's a great story. Does anybody want to tackle? Yeah, go.
So our takeaway was kind of off of that point, and just talking about a lot of the current refugees and their inability to go back home, and talking about, not only the physical ability to go home, but the mental ability to find or go home. And historically, people were much more mobile, lived a more nomadic lifestyle, which is, like you were saying, immobility now is more common. And just the idea of what does that look like now with people that are unable to go home.
Right, or just the sort of tension between that some people who are moving against their will and other people who are choosing not to move at all, right? That is it's an interesting tension to think about it from both those perspectives. Did anybody tackle, or does anybody want to talk about the question about the suitor's rage, the suitors and Odysseus's rage? Yeah. Got the support of your group there.
We were discussing who on earth could blame you for your rage? Who is asking this question now? Of whom? And how can we understand the rage we experience now in our society? The white supremacists, the poor and left out, and how do we get past it to action, to know what to do, to welcome the stranger?
So, and also, what does it mean to ask that question of the foreigner rather than asking the question of ourselves, right? I mean, so I think that's part of what one underlies is not so much the reality. There are real people coming to this country, but also why we choose to put on to immigrants questions that maybe, are better left for ourselves. And so that question of who could blame you for your rage or your cuteness is maybe a question that. So, is it easier for us to answer when it's projected onto the foreigner rather than projected onto ourselves, or is that a cop-out? I don't know what you think. Pardon? There's the foreigner right there. There's a little interloper. Hi. There you go. There you go. So the table in the center in the back, you all were talking about this question a little bit.
I don't think we're the table that you were referring to,
Right.
but in our conversation, we realized how every question raised more questions, and so that was part of it. And with the question of what does the future hold, and the question of the sense of personal responsibility, how welcoming are we personally, and what's our idea about the moral standing of that, and societal responsibility for people who are coming to this country, but not just, I raised the thing of also we have homeless from our own population, and how we relate to that and how we relate to them has also similar kinds of reverberations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So we were talking about how in this day and age where language is being brought front and center, and how we use language, how do we create a healthy, authentic rapport with strangers? As a white person, to ask somebody of color, where are you from, could be taken totally offensively. And then also, to kind of go off that question is, how has the internet and changed this dynamic of language and communicating with each other, because it brings us closer and allows more opportunity, while also kind of putting this barrier so that we're all arm's length from each other. Right.
I mean, so I think part of so Bonnie Honig is the theorist I introduced, who has this notion of sort of flipping the question around. And I think it's precisely to stop thinking of the question of the foreigner as only the question we direct at the foreigner. Who are you? Where are you from, right? But instead to think about the question of being one that comes from the foreigner or comes from that experience. So I think partly what, and so I guess what I'm not an expert in contemporary immigration practices, but I think partly what I'm trying to suggest is that perhaps the Odyssey can help us frame those questions a little bit, and it can help us precisely because for all that it tries to fall into, and for all that it tries to have this kind of dualism of traveling and home and Odysseus and returning, it undercuts that at every single stage. And so it's undercutting the very notion that there is a home, that the people who you think of are your family, they look like strangers, and vice versa. So I think perhaps what I'm hoping is that returning to this poem, which I think we thought of as being old and settled, and perhaps we thought of it as just the story of an adventurer who finally gets home. That's the whole story, is that it itself already has this possibility to start asking different questions, or to show that the same questions in a different context have a completely different set of reverberations. So I think partly it's just to start thinking about different kinds of questions. As for the internet, I don't know what I think about the internet. I think, again, this is where I feel like there are so many parallels between the world we're in living now and the archaic period in which for them, the internet was writing, right? So for the world of the Odyssey, the destabilizing force is the alphabet, which starts to write, which starts to fix and interferes with flexible and fluid oral tradition of poetry. So what do you do there? And so again, that's what I think part of the Odyssey is also about. The Odyssey is celebrating a more fluid, open, expansive notion of narrative, by contrast to the Iliad, which is this fixed and monumental and final poem. And so when Odysseus is trying to sail past the sirens, the thing that the sirens say to him that is so enticing is they say, "We know how good you were at Troy. We know how famous you are." They're not offering sex. They're just saying, you were so great. And so in many ways, I think part of what the sirens represent is the tension of saying the same story in the same way over and over again. And the Odyssey is about sailing on by and moving forward and going backwards and going around in circles. And so I think that I don't have an answer to the internet. I just think that it presents for us a similar cognitive and structural shift to the way we've thought about communicating with people and how safe that is, and whether we can trust the stories that we hear, or whether they're lying tales and they can't be trusted. And those are similar questions that we're asking if we're not have a different system.
We have time for one more question or comment.
Yeah, we got one more.
I think we were the table that you were talking about, and we actually addressed the question about who could blame you for your rage, and some of us had a difficult time being sympathetic to rage and thinking that Odysseus really sort of brought on a lot of his own undoing and his. But I guess then we sort of eventually evolved to making a comparison between contemporary veterans, basically, which was he had experienced a tremendous war, and when he came home, he expected everything to sort of be the same. And that isn't what happens when you're at war. You come back and you've been in a place that is very different, that is violent, and it's your whole life. And then when you come back to a space that you think you're going to understand, everything goes on the way it normally has been, and you wonder, how is it these people don't comprehend what we've experienced in wartime? And as a result, some people get violent, they get depressed, they commit suicide. So I guess I became a little bit more sympathetic to his plight, although not completely. So it really, I think, brought on an aspect that I hadn't thought of before, and some people at our table actually got a perspective from a veteran, basically, a war veteran.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's another thing that the point that the Odyssey makes is that war is as alienating as traveling to another country. So, the returning from war and returning from somewhere foreign and strange get overlapped onto each other in that poem. So I just want to thank you for letting me pose these questions to you, and it's been great to listen to the questions that the discussions that you've had. And what I most want to have you take away is just the potential that the Odyssey has to pose for us to keep coming back to it as a poem that's infinitely expansive and productive and generative, and not as a place to find answers, but in fact as a place that encourages us to keep asking new questions, and above all, what does it mean to be at home? How do we get there, and what it's like when we do. So thank you very much. It's been fun.